You're listening to The Capital Table. Private capital markets have been evolving for many years, but never more so than in recent times. Take a seat at the Capital Table with leading experts discussing insights into the private equity and M&A worlds, and take away the knowledge you need to excel in a rapidly changing marketplace. We know this is one table you'll leave feeling full and satisfied.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Capital Table. I'm Steve Brady, partner with Witham and market leader of our transaction advisory practice. Excited today to have joining us our friends Paul Marino and Drew Bradley as we talk about the independent sponsor edge, positioning for competitive advantage. You know, Paul and Drew, the market's heating up, and our friends in the independent sponsor community that we're going to see at our symposium in Miami in January are trying to be competitive in this very interesting market. So let's start with introductions. So Drew, I'll let you go first alphabetically, and we'll dive into it.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for hosting this again. And Paul, it's great to see you again. Drew here with Frisch Capital Partners. We work exclusively with independent sponsors, helping them raise equity and debt. We've been doing it for next year, be 30 years we've been doing this exclusively. So super excited to not only be on here today, but also excited to see everybody in Miami down at the Earnout. If you haven't registered, be sure to check it out. I know we'll sell out like we did last year.
Thanks, Steve. I now wish my name was Aaron Alexander, because then I would have went first. But this is Paul Marino, Sadis and Goldberg. I run our corporate and M&A group and deal with a lot of independent sponsors and private equity. In fact, most of our practice is centered around independent sponsors. We think it's a great avenue and the biggest growth factor in middle market private equity and lower middle market private equity.
Well, thanks again, guys, for joining us. So let's dive in. Again, deal activity is picking up. Valuations, for the most part, across sectors are holding, and some may view, given the quality of some of the deals, a little on the frothy side still. We'll see how that market plays out when activity really picks up. But independent sponsors have to position themselves to win. And Paul, let's start with you, how you're seeing sponsors, doing that, winning deals without committed capital is always a factor, obviously, for independent sponsors by definition, but they're in a unique position to win.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that is really, or the answer, I should say, has evolved over a period of time. So, sponsors, independent sponsors, or back in the politically incorrect days of fundless sponsors, did run into a lot of issues as it relates to winning transactions because they don't have a pool of capital behind them. In fact, service providers such as myself and law firms or accounting firms really shied away from them because you were always afraid that if the deal went sideways, you wouldn't get paid. But a lot of that has changed over the last, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years, and not just because of the ability and sophistication to get deals done and more equity and debt providers in the space, and Drew could talk about that as well. But it's a lot of it has to do with the sellers. So sellers are looking at independent sponsors as partners in deals because so many sellers are staying on and rolling equity over and looking at independent sponsors as a less threatening way to cash some money, take some money off the table, roll some equity forward, and less threatening than maybe a private equity firm would otherwise come in and really rearrange all of the deck furniture and or maybe fire them. And I think that sponsors have much more of a grasp on the operations of the business. And again, this isn't a slight to private equity, but I do think that sponsors do understand the business, especially in the lower middle market, than maybe a larger financial private equity institution that is greater financial modeling, but not necessarily understanding the business at a granular or grassroots level. And let me add to that just one other thing. When you think about a lot of private equity firms now, the evolution of a private equity analyst or directors probably starts at a wirehouse or a large investment bank on the sell side, and then they move the evolution is they'll move to the buy side, and they don't have a lot of practical experience running businesses. Now, I'm not saying every one of them, and I'm certainly not saying that a lot of them can't understand, can't operate a business. But when you're operating in the lower middle market, it's just a different glide path than you would at a higher, at a corporate institutional level. So I think that's a big part of it. As far as writing a check into a deal, it's still important. I think that people want, and again, I'll let Drew answer this because he really deals day in, day out. But I think that investors want to see the independent sponsor have committed capital, so they're not afraid, or I should say they're not inclined to just leave if things go sideways. Drew?
Yeah, I want to expand on what you said, Paul, because I think you bring up some good points. The independent sponsor ecosystem, there's always been this discussion about how do you win deals over committed capital, and I think a lot of times independent sponsors think they're at a decided disadvantage, and private equity thinks they're at an advantage, and I actually think it's not true at all. If you look at the underlying motivating factors that drive a seller's decision of who they're going to go with when they're selling their business, there's a portion of the market where money is the deciding factor. They want top dollar. They want to, get all that they can. And those independent sponsors, in my opinion, they really are never going to compete in those deals, and they shouldn't wasting their time trying to compete in those deals if top dollar is what they want. Let private equity go duke that out and just move on to the next one. But there's a huge portion of the seller universe, to your point, Paul, that, there's other things. Yes, money's important, so I'm not discounting it's important, but they want to sell to somebody that they also trust, to your point, and they think is going to be a good steward of their people or their legacy or their business and or their rolling equity, to your point, and they want to stay on. So that partnership mentality is really important to them. And I do think you're right. I think you said it well, that they're independent sponsors can be somewhat diffusing compared to, quote, private equity that people have built up into their head, kind of what that is. But why is that? And in my opinion, it's because independent sponsors do one of a couple things, but fundamentally, oftentimes they invest more time really getting to know the sellers, and or a lot of them also have industry or operational expertise that they might be able to bring to the table, either themselves or one of their partners or an operating partner that they work with, that can kind of diffuse the seller and bring it down to where, look, if I just throw a stereotype out there, a large private equity shop might throw an associate on a first-time call with a seller that's asking 10 canned questions of a seller, and it doesn't come across as very personal, or you understand me. I'm not discounting that person's smart, but an independent sponsor that comes in there and can really, go like 4 or 5 levels deep with a seller in their industry and their topic, or spend time to get to know them more personally, it goes a long way for sellers. And so I think that's a huge advantage that independent sponsors have, that is a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like they don't think it's an advantage, but it is. I'm at a lack of words right now, but it's like a secret weapon that they have to win deals. And we see it happen all the time. And even finding things at lower valuations because of that, because people say, hey, I want to partner with you. I don't care that I have 8 times on the table. I want to do a deal with you at 6 times or 6.5 times. And we see that all the time. So I totally agree with you, on that point. And I do think, from a capital provider's perspective, the skin in the game really comes into play on the capital provider side when independent sponsors are partnering up with their capital providers, and capital providers really like to see that, quote, skin in the game, that alignment of interest with the independent sponsor, to where they're not just rolling a fee or taking cash off the table and just, quote, getting a free ride out of the deal, but they really have some skin in the game. But the nice thing for independent sponsors is you got to realize that it doesn't always have to be your money. Yes, it could be your personal money, but it could be friends and family. It could be, family. It could be, former colleagues or bosses or partners at your old firm. And in fact, a lot of capital providers really like it when there's that, I call it like the Thanksgiving table skin in the game, where you got to go to Thanksgiving next year and see those people or talk to them at somebody's birthday party next year. If this thing goes sideways, you're not going to want to go to Thanksgiving. And so that can be a real motivating factor to get in there and get your hands dirty.
Great point.
Yeah,
Absolutely. A number of great points you both made in that dialogue, and I certainly want to pull on one thread, or maybe better said, emphasize one of the points. And it's where I've seen, where independent sponsors can be almost magical in relating to, again, the lower middle market entrepreneur person who started their business and is, it's personal to them, that business, and then they can relate to them oftentimes as someone who's run a business, as someone who knows their industry. Again, all the points you guys have already made, so not to repeat those, but really to emphasize it's that relatability that all of a sudden a business owner, they've worked so hard with this business, and they just get very comfortable that independent sponsor, when it works, is going to really take care of their legacy, for lack of a better way to say it. So, kind of moving on. So, great points on how they can win, but then they got to look at the deal, and, in this environment, again, you're hopefully always looking for growing businesses and looking at businesses that you want to transform to the next level. So, Drew, let's start with you. Talk about the strategies for underwriting growth in these deals and the value creation opportunities. Again, just the strategies around the deal when the multiples, again, generally are still very high right now.
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question. I do think, there's been this thought that they're going to come careening down multiples, but they really haven't. I mean, I think they've come down in some industries, or they've kind of stabilized and they're not continuing to rise, but they're not just dropping to the floor. But I think I'm going to answer this question in a slight and maybe a roundabout way here. But one of the things that we tell independent sponsors all the time is you have to be a value buyer. It doesn't have to mean you have to be buying things for like 10 cents on the dollar, but you have to be very valuation conscious, okay? Because as an independent sponsor, you always have to be aware that your economics are getting layered on top of somebody else's, whether it's somebody that's a committed pool of capital and they've got LPs in their own economics, or whether it's a family office and they're underwriting their own returns for the deal. And so valuations are super important. So in our opinion, you have to be very disciplined, but this is going to behoove you not only for your economics and garnering interest on the capital provider side, but long-term, when you think about exiting on the back end, it's super important. So I think, building your thesis around a particular industry and whether it's a buy and build or organic growth, but weaving the story and the narrative to sellers to get them to understand that quote second bite of the apple, where that rollover equity is going to be more valuable and aligned, to be able to hopefully demonstrate that, like, hey, I'm not going to pay top dollar. If you want 12 times for your business, I'm not your buyer, but I'd pay 6.5 times for this business or 5 times for this business, and you can roll over 30%. And with that second bite, we're going to get you up to a significantly larger bite in that second one. Here's the vision of where we want to go with it. And so I do think that you have to be valuation conscious as an independent sponsor, and you can't just pay up because a sell side banker says they want you to pay up. I tell people all the time, look, you should pass on deals where price is top dollar. But when you want that partner that we were talking about earlier, and people are willing to be flexible with you on the valuation, that's super important. I get pushback all the time from people that, like, hey, it's impossible to find something. And all I can say is that, look, every day, we're working on a deal right now where the average valuation of multiple deals coming together is right at 3 times EBITDA. And it's a service company where people said it was impossible. Another one is 6.5 times. So, but that's independent sponsors. They get out there and they hustle and they find these things. And it's what I love about working with independent sponsors. It's the grind.
Great points, Drew. Paul, your thoughts on strategizing how they should be underwriting and being competitive in this environment?
Well, I mean, again, first things, like as Drew said, you got to really know. You got to know what you don't know first, and then move to what you do know, right? And what you don't know, you need to get smart on that fast. I have found most independent sponsors, middle market, lower middle market, private equity professionals, they can't afford to make mistakes. at their level, at 500 million and under. It sounds like a lot of money, and it is for sure. But you have to actually operate like a small market baseball team. You have to be, you got to really kind of dig in, get as many data points as you can. Be quick to hit the bid on something that you believe is has a lot of value, and be slow if your gut tells you that something might be overpriced or not necessarily in your target path, because deals are emotional and you get excited about doing something. And, when you're underwriting something, you have to take all the emotion out of it. And again, at this level, it's very hard to make mistakes because there's not a lot of money.
And to that point, if I can add to what you're saying, Paul, maybe a practical way that people can do what you and I are talking about is literally call up a bunch of people in a space. 2 deals we're working on right now. One of them, the independent sponsor, has spoken to over 100 companies in this vertical in the last 12 months. And the other one, the independent sponsor, has spoken to about 300, just shy of 300 companies in this industry in the last 18 to 24 months. And that's a lot of hustle. That's a lot of phone calls. It's a lot of grinding. It's a lot of getting on the phone and talking to sellers. And that's not just all broker deals and bank deals. And to your point, I think a lot of times people want to hit the easy button and they just want to focus on brokered or banked processes. And that's fine. Like, look at plenty of those, but also get out there and talk to sellers, because if you talk to 100 companies or 50 companies, even, don't even pick 100, but if you talk to 50 and you ask a bunch of questions about running those businesses, where'd you start today versus what do you know today versus when you started? Where do you see the business going in the next 10 years? What do you see as the biggest challenges, facing your business in the next 5 to 10 years? Who are you competing against? And you ask a bunch of questions, you shut up and listen. Like, people will tell you so much about their industry and you'll gain so much knowledge. And then all of a sudden, what you'll be able to differentiate is you'll be able to understand the difference between a good and a great company in the industry. And then you might find a good company, but then you know how to make it great, versus the independent sponsor that is just opportunistically finding a single deal from a broker or a banker in an industry, and they don't actually know if it's a good versus a great company or how to make it great if it's just a good company. And so that really getting your hands dirty and talking to people and to, you can have multiple theses that you're pursuing, but when you find one, man, plant that flag in the ground and dig deep in that vertical, get as smart as you can, and talking to sellers is one of the best ways to do it.
Absolutely. Those are great points for independent sponsors and positioning for competitive advantage. And really to emphasize, one thing, and Drew kind of touched on it when he was talking about capital providers, but all these positive ways to approach a deal and position yourself for a competitive advantage obviously also translates into when they are going out to get the capital, that they're in the right position for capital providers to also be excited about the deal, their knowledge of the business, their knowledge of the industry, what they're bringing to the table. So a good start to our discussion for our audience. We're going to have part 2 of this when we'll talk more about kind of the backside of it with structuring and raising that capital. So Paul, Drew, thanks for joining us for part 1 of 2 of Positioning for Competitive Advantage.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having us.
We'll talk to you guys soon.
You've been listening to The Capital Table. For more information, please visit withum.com. Thank you for listening.